Even the SEAL commander had surrendered, until she picked up the rifle they dropped. The desert wind cut sharp against her face that day, a mixture of grit and silence heavy with consequence. It was not just a weapon she held, it was a reminder of the unshakable courage that had carried her through fire and shadow. Her name was Captain Sarah Whitmore, a Navy veteran whose presence alone spoke of battles fought both on and off the battlefield. Long before her name carried the weight of respect, Sarah had been a quiet child from a small town in Maine. She grew up in a house where discipline was not enforced by words but by the rhythm of survival, chores done before sunrise, winters endured without complaint, and the constant ache of watching her father limp home after long shifts at the mill. She remembered standing by the cracked window, watching snowflakes fall, her small hand pressed to the glass as she wondered what courage really meant. It was that wondering, that quiet fire, that would later carry her into a world few dared to step into. When Sarah first enlisted, she did not chase glory. She chased meaning. The Navy gave her both structure and escape, a path that demanded everything yet offered belonging in return. Boot camp stripped away her doubts one command at a time, and though her hands often trembled at night as she clutched her journal, her heart grew steadier with each sunrise. Her instructors noticed something rare in her, an ability to absorb pain without letting it harden her spirit. She learned to run on tired legs, to breathe through the ache of exhaustion, and to find clarity in the chaos of drills shouted across rain-soaked fields. But the title of veteran was not carved in those early days. It was forged later, during a deployment where the ground itself seemed to tremble with the weight of war. She served alongside SEALs, medics, and young men who carried laughter on their lips even in the darkest corners of the night. Sarah was not the loudest voice among them, but her presence steadied the others like a hand pressed firmly to a shaking shoulder. One evening, when the sun bled crimson into the horizon, her unit faced a standoff that tested every ounce of resolve. The air was thick with dust, and the ground bore the weight of fatigue. Even the commander, a man known for his iron will, lowered his rifle, surrender in his eyes as if the burden had grown too heavy to carry. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the crack of her own breathing inside her helmet. Yet, in that fragile moment, she stepped forward. She picked up the rifle that had slipped from his grasp, the weapon cold and heavy in her hands. The silence that followed was not just of men holding their breath but of history itself pausing, watching. From that moment on, she was not just Whitmore. She was the woman who did not break. Years later, after her service ended, Sarah often looked back on that night. She did not dwell on the fear nor the sudden surge of command that had fallen into her hands. Instead, she remembered the weight of responsibility, how it pressed against her shoulders like an invisible pack she could never set down. Her transition into civilian life was not marked by parades or banners. It was marked by quiet mornings, the sound of her coffee pot dripping in a kitchen too still, too empty. The world outside moved forward, yet her heart remained half-rooted in deserts and half-rooted in the forests of home. Sometimes, in the hush of dawn, Sarah would open the small leather journal she had carried since her enlistment. Its pages, worn thin from years of sweat and sand, bore fragments of her younger self, scribbled hopes, sketches of distant horizons, letters she never sent. One line, written in shaky ink during her first deployment, often caught her eyes: "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking with it beside you." That sentence became her compass, long after the rifles were set aside and the uniforms folded into cedar chests. People who met her in her later years would not have guessed the depths of her journey. They saw a woman with kind eyes and a smile touched by quiet strength. They noticed how she listened more than she spoke, how she carried herself with dignity, even in silence. What they did not see were the nights she woke in a cold sweat, the echoes of gunfire still haunting her dreams. They did not see her pause at the grocery store, hands trembling when a loud sound cracked across the aisles. Yet Sarah never let those shadows define her. She chose to live as though every day was a testament, not to survival alone, but to the beauty of rising after being bent low. Her story did not begin on a battlefield. It began with a girl standing by a frosted window, wondering what courage meant. And it would continue in ways that touched lives quietly, like ripples across still water. For Sarah, beginnings were never about where she came from or where she went. They were about who she became in the spaces between, when even the commander had surrendered, and she had the strength to stand. War leaves its mark long after the uniforms are folded away. For Captain Sarah Whitmore, the greatest battles began not in the desert winds but in the quiet of her own home, where silence had a way of echoing louder than gunfire. At first, she told herself she was fine. She had survived firefights, survived nights when the air itself shook with mortar rounds, survived watching friends fall and still finding the strength to stand. Civilian life, she believed, should have been easier. But in truth, it was harder. There were no commands to follow, no schedules sharp enough to anchor her. The steady rhythm of military life, the drills, the routines, the certainty of duty, was gone, and in its place lay an unstructured freedom that felt more like a vast, empty desert. She remembered the first time she stood in the middle of a crowded supermarket, staring at rows of brightly colored boxes that all screamed for her attention. The chatter of families, the squeak of carts, the sharp crack of something dropping to the floor, it all swirled together into a storm inside her chest. Her hands began to tremble, her breath short and sharp, as if she were back under fire. To others, it looked like a woman simply frozen by indecision over a brand of cereal. But to Sarah, it was a battlefield. She left without buying anything, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill her ears. Nights were no easier. She would jolt awake in the early hours, drenched in sweat, her body convinced it had heard the familiar whistle of incoming rounds. Sometimes she found herself standing by the window, gripping the curtain as though waiting for orders that would never come. She told no one. Instead, she smiled politely at neighbors, reassured her family with gentle words, and carried the weight in silence. The hardest part was losing her sense of purpose. In the Navy, every action mattered. Lives depended on her choices, her steady hands, her ability to lead when fear threatened to consume. Out here, in the quiet suburban streets, her days seemed to blur. No one saluted when she walked into a room. No one looked to her for direction. Her journal, once filled with notes of courage and conviction, now gathered dust on the nightstand. Sarah's struggle was not only internal. The world around her often seemed to misunderstand. When she applied for jobs, interviewers praised her service but hesitated to hire her, their eyes flickering with unspoken questions about whether she was too hardened or too damaged. Friends from her hometown welcomed her back but did not know how to ask about her years overseas. Conversations stalled after polite thank yous, leaving her isolated in a crowd. And then there were the moments of guilt, heavier than any pack she had carried. Survivor's guilt, they called it, though no name seemed to soften its edges. She remembered faces, names, voices of those who had not returned. Sometimes she heard their laughter in her dreams. Sometimes, she caught herself thinking she had no right to live so quietly when they had given everything. Her heart felt heavy, as though tethered to memories she could not release. Yet within the struggle, there was also a fragile thread of resilience. Sarah knew that survival did not end with the war, it continued here, in the small and unremarkable places where her spirit felt most tested. She began to walk in the mornings, long before the town awoke. The cool air against her skin reminded her of early deployments, of quiet hours before chaos struck. She started writing again, short entries at first, just a few words. I walked today. I breathed today. I'm still here. Some days, her hands trembled too much to hold the pen. On those days, she simply sat with her journal in her lap, letting the silence wash over her. She discovered that healing was not a single act of bravery but 1,000 small choices, each one as difficult, in its own way, as picking up that rifle years ago. Still, the shadows persisted. The loneliness pressed against her like a weight she could not shrug off. She felt disconnected from the very world she had fought to protect. Her reflection in the mirror showed not the strong officer others remembered but a woman searching for herself in unfamiliar ground. It was in this fragile state, torn between memory and the present, that Sarah began to understand, struggle was not a sign of weakness. It was the price of living through what many could not imagine. The chapters of her life were far from over. Though she could not yet see it, a turning point was waiting, born not from the battlefield this time, but from the courage to ask for help, to open her heart to healing, and to let others walk beside her. For now, her story remained one of survival in silence, of battles unseen but deeply felt. She carried them not as scars to be hidden, but as reminders that even the strongest warriors must learn how to live again when the war is over. The first time Sarah admitted she needed help, her voice shook. It wasn't the tremor of weakness, but the raw sound of someone who had carried too much for too long. For years, she had believed that to endure silently was the truest form of strength. But silence had turned into chains, and one morning, as the dawn spilled pale light across her kitchen, she realized she could no longer carry the weight alone. She started with something small. A phone call to a local veteran center, her fingers trembling so violently that she had to dial twice. The receptionist's voice was warm, calm, and entirely unremarkable, yet for Sarah, it was as if someone had extended a hand across a vast, empty chasm. "We're glad you called," the voice said. And for the first time in years, she felt less alone. The center became a quiet refuge. The walls were simple, lined with faded photographs and worn couches, but within those walls lived stories like hers. She met other veterans, men and women whose eyes carried the same weight, whose laughter rang with both joy and sorrow. They spoke of sleepless nights, of sudden panic in crowded places, of the guilt that pressed against their ribs like a stone. Sarah listened, and slowly, cautiously, she began to speak. Her words at first came haltingly, as if dragged from the depths of a locked chest. "I can't walk into grocery stores without feeling like I'm back there," she admitted once, her hands twisting in her lap. A young Marine beside her nodded in recognition. An older nurse placed a hand gently on her arm. In their understanding, Sarah discovered something she had been missing: connection. But healing did not come all at once. There were days she left the center feeling lighter, as though she had set down a burden. There were others when she drove home with tears streaking her face, angry that she was not better already. Still, she kept going. She learned that resilience was not a straight path but a winding one, full of stumbles and small victories. One afternoon, during a group hike organized by the center, Sarah felt something shift. The trail was steep, and her legs burned with every step, but the rhythm of her breathing reminded her of the drills she once endured. The forest around her was alive with the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves, so different from the desert winds, yet just as grounding. As she reached the ridge, the view opened wide, rolling hills bathed in sunlight, endless sky stretching above. She stood still, letting the wind brush her face, and for a moment, she felt free. She realized then that healing was not about forgetting. It was about learning to carry memory without letting it crush her. She began to write again, not just in fragments but in whole passages. In her journal, she poured out the stories she had once kept locked inside, the friends she lost, the fear that gnawed at her, the moments of unexpected beauty in the midst of chaos. Writing became her way of honoring the past without being consumed by it. Her words carried grief, yes, but also gratitude. She wrote about the medic who once pressed a hand to her shoulder in reassurance, about the laughter of her unit around a dim campfire, about the desert night sky glittering with stars that no war could touch. As months passed, Sarah also allowed herself to reconnect with the world outside of veteran circles. She volunteered at a local school, speaking to young students about resilience and courage. She did not share the brutal details but instead spoke of lessons learned. Courage is not about being fearless. It's about moving forward, even when fear walks beside you. Her words resonated with children who face their own quiet battles, bullying, self-doubt, uncertainty about the future. In their eyes, she saw a reflection of the girl she once was, staring out a frosted window in Maine, wondering what courage meant. The turning point was not one grand moment of triumph but 1,000 smaller ones strung together like beads on a cord. It was the laughter she found herself sharing with new friends over coffee. It was the first night she slept through without waking in terror. It was the moment she looked in the mirror and no longer saw only the veteran haunted by war but also the woman who had survived, who was learning to live again. Sarah still carried her scars. They did not vanish, nor did the memories. But she no longer saw them as signs of brokenness. They became proof of endurance, a testament to a life that had faced both darkness and light. The rifle she once picked up in the desert had been a symbol of survival. Now, her journal, her voice, and her willingness to keep walking forward became symbols of healing. Standing on that ridge during another hike months later, Sarah closed her eyes and let the wind wash over her once more. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "I'm still here." And in that simple truth lay the deepest turning point of all. The years softened around her like the edges of an old photograph. Captain Sarah Whitmore was no longer defined by the weight of her uniform, nor solely by the shadows of war. Instead, she had become something steadier, something brighter, a living reminder that survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. She often began her mornings the same way, with a walk through her neighborhood just as the sun lifted itself over the horizon. The light spilled gently across the rooftops, warming the quiet streets, and Sarah let its glow sink into her skin like a blessing. These walks were her meditation, a daily reminder that peace was not found in silence alone but in choosing to notice the world around her, the birds perched on wires, the children waiting at the bus stop, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery opening its doors. She had learned to let the small things matter. After years of living in extremes, life or death, danger or safety, Sarah now found joy in the ordinary. She planted a garden, her hands working the soil with patience. She joined a community choir, though her voice sometimes faltered, and found that music soothed her in ways words could not. On weekends, she met other veterans for coffee, their conversations a mixture of jokes, shared memories, and the occasional silence that needed no explanation. But reflection did not mean erasing the past. Sarah carried her memories with reverence, as if they were sacred stones in her pocket. She still thought often of those who had not returned, their faces etched into her heart. On some evenings, she sat on her porch with her journal open and wrote their names across the page, whispering each one aloud. "You are remembered," she would say softly. The ritual brought her peace, a way of honoring without drowning in grief. The turning point of her healing had taught her something profound: scars were not endings. They were beginnings carved by survival, maps of where she had been and guides to where she was going. That knowledge shaped the way she spoke to others. When young women approached her after community talks, eyes wide with admiration, Sarah never spoke only of bravery. Instead, she told them about endurance, about how strength sometimes looked like tears shed in the dark, or the courage to ask for help when silence felt safer. Strength, she often said, her voice gentle but firm, is not the absence of struggle. It's the decision to keep living, even when living feels like the hardest thing to do. Those words resonated beyond classrooms and veterans' halls. Parents wrote to her, thanking her for inspiring their children. Strangers approached her in grocery stores to say her story had given them courage in their own battles, addiction, illness, loss. Sarah accepted their gratitude with humility, her quiet smile carrying the unspoken truth that she was still learning, still healing, still human. There were days when the old weight pressed against her again, when a sound startled her, when sleep eluded her, when grief resurfaced without warning. But instead of seeing these moments as failures, she recognized them as reminders that healing was not a destination but a lifelong journey. And she no longer walked that road alone. The woman who once carried the burden of silence now carried a message of hope. She had found ways to transform her pain into purpose, her memories into teachings, her scars into symbols of survival. Where once she stood with a rifle in her hands, steadying a faltering unit, now she stood with open hands, steadying others who felt they could not go on. On the anniversary of her retirement, Sarah returned to the ridge where she had once stood during her first hike with the Veteran Center. The hills rolled out before her, green and endless, the sky above vast and forgiving. She closed her eyes, feeling the breeze tug gently at her hair, and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not only for the life she had lived but for the chance to live still. Her heart no longer felt heavy as it once had. Instead, it carried a quiet strength, the kind born not from battles won but from resilience endured. She knew the world would never see all the depths of her journey. But that was not the point. What mattered was that she had survived, she had healed, and she had chosen to keep moving forward. For Sarah Whitmore, reflection was not about looking back with sorrow. It was about looking ahead with hope. And as the sun slipped higher into the sky, she smiled, a smile touched not by the weight of what she had endured, but by the promise of all that was still to come.